The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Harold Briggs stood at the far end of the station platform with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed somewhere past Amelia's left shoulder, as though looking directly at her might cost him something. He was shorter than she'd imagined from his letters, with a patchy beard and a mouth that seemed to default to a sneer. Behind him, three of his friends leaned against the rail, watching, grinning, saying nothing. And that silence was the worst part. That smirking silence that told Amelia they had known this was coming before she'd even stepped off the train. Too stubborn, Harold said, to no one in particular. Too much trouble. Send her and the boy away. Not to her face. To the marriage broker standing beside him. As though Amelia were a crate of goods that had arrived damaged, something to be logged and returned without the courtesy of eye contact. Amelia did not cry. She had used up most of her tears somewhere in eastern Nebraska, in a rail car that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, when Ethan had asked her for the fourth time that morning if they were almost there and she hadn't known how to answer him. She stood on that Wyoming platform with the December wind cutting straight through her coat, and she did not make a sound. But her hands, gripping the handle of the one good bag she owned, went white at the knuckles. Ethan pressed against her side. He was 5 years old and small for his age, with her dark hair and his father's eyes, and he had been watching the men across the platform with the careful, measuring stillness of a child who had already learned that adult conversations about him rarely went well. He didn't ask what was happening. He just leaned into her and waited. That was the thing about Ethan. He already knew how to wait. If you've ever stood in a place you traveled 1,000 miles to reach and realized within minutes that it was already over. Subscribe to this channel right now because this story is for you. Hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what happens next on that platform is only the beginning of something none of them saw coming. Amelia Whitaker was 31 years old, and she had already survived more than most people twice her age. She had survived her husband walking out when Ethan was 8 months old. Not dramatically, not with a fight, just gone one Tuesday morning. His side of the wardrobe emptied out with a neatness that still unsettled her when she thought about it. She had survived 3 years in her sister's spare room in Cincinnati, taking in mending and alterations until her fingers ached, eating smaller portions than she served her son so he'd have enough. She had survived the particular humiliation of being a woman in 1883 with a child and no husband and no prospects, the way neighbors' conversations went quiet when she approached, the way certain women looked at Ethan as though his existence was a moral failing on her part. She was not naive. She had understood, when she answered the advertisement in the Ohio Gazette, that mail-order marriage was not romance. It was a transaction, and she had gone into it with her eyes open. Harold Briggs had written her 5 letters over 6 weeks, and they were not warm letters, but they were honest enough. He needed a woman to manage his household. He had a small cattle operation outside Laramie. He was not a refined man, but he was a steady one, or so he'd implied. He had not mentioned in any of those 5 letters that the presence of a child was a problem. He mentioned it on the platform. 3 days after her arrival, the marriage broker, a stout woman named Mrs. Dolan, who wore the expression of someone perpetually managing other people's disasters, had pulled Amelia aside on the first evening and told her to give it time. Harold was adjusting. Men in his position weren't accustomed to children underfoot. Amelia had bitten her tongue and nodded and gone back to the small room at the boarding house where she and Ethan were staying and told herself she could make it work. She had made harder things work. She had lasted 72 hours. On the 3rd morning, Harold had come to the boarding house with 2 of his friends, those same friends now leaning against the platform rail, and he'd spoken to Mrs. Dolan while Amelia sat in the parlor and listened through a door that was not quite closed. He'd used the word burden twice. He'd used the phrase more than I bargained for once. He had not lowered his voice. When she came through that door, she didn't give him the satisfaction of tears or pleading. She had looked Harold Briggs in the eye and said quietly, "You could have mentioned this in your letters. You had 6 of them." He'd looked away. That was when she knew. He'd hoped she'd just accept it, that she'd send Ethan somewhere and be the woman he'd ordered, that she had no other choice. He had badly misjudged what kind of woman Amelia Whitaker was. But misreading a man's character did not put food on the table. And standing on a platform in Laramie in December with $12 and a 5-year-old and a single bag of belongings was not a position that left much room for pride. Amelia was furious. She was also calculating, the way she'd taught herself to be after years of not having the luxury of falling apart. She turned away from Harold Briggs and the rail and his friends without another word, took Ethan's hand, and walked back toward the station office. Mrs. Dolan found her there 20 minutes later. "I'm sorry about Harold," the woman said, settling into the chair across from her with the tired competence of someone who had navigated this particular conversation many times before. "He's not a bad man, I don't need your assessment of Harold," Amelia said, not unkindly, but clearly. "I need to know if there's another arrangement. I'm not going back east." Mrs. Dolan looked at her over the top of her spectacles for a long moment. There was something in that look, not quite respect, but the beginnings of it. "There's one possibility," the woman said, "but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you up front that 3 women before you have already turned it down." "Tell me anyway." Mrs. Dolan opened the leather satchel on her lap and produced a folded letter, slightly worn at the creases, as though it had been handled and reconsidered more than once. She set it on the table between them. "His name is Caleb Hunter," she said. "He runs a cattle operation up in the Black Creek Valley, about 30 miles north of town. Isolated. The access road into that property is rough even in good weather, and in winter it can be impassable for days at a stretch. He's been ranching up there alone for 6 years. She paused. The 3 women who looked at this arrangement, 2 of them didn't get past reading the letter. The 3rd one went out there for a week and came back on foot. Amelia looked at the letter. "What's wrong with him?" "Hard to say exactly. He doesn't talk much. The ranch is genuinely remote. The work is hard. He's not an easy man." Mrs. Dolan said it carefully, the way you say something true that could be misunderstood. "But he's never been violent, never been cruel, not that anyone's documented. He's just very alone, and I think he's been alone so long he's forgotten how to be otherwise." "Does he know about Ethan?" "I wrote to him. He sent back 1 line. She tapped the letter. "It's in there." Amelia unfolded the letter. The handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of a man who wrote when he had something to say and not otherwise, blocky letters with no flourish. She read it twice. It was 4 paragraphs, and 3 of them were practical to the point of bluntness. What the ranch required, what the conditions were, what he could offer in terms of wages and provision. The 4th paragraph was 1 sentence. She read it a 3rd time. "I need a wife. I need help on the ranch. I cannot promise easy days, but I will protect you and your child." She set the letter down. She looked at Ethan, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her with his head tilted against the wall, his small mouth slightly open. She thought about Harold Briggs saying burden through an almost closed door. She thought about $12. She thought about the train back east and the spare room at her sister's house, and the way Cincinnati would receive her return. She thought about Ethan growing up knowing, in the wordless way children always know, that his mother had come back defeated. "I'll go," she said. Mrs. Dolan did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, quietly resigned, the way you look when you've done everything you can to give someone all the information they need, and now it's simply out of your hands. "I'll send word tonight," the woman said. "He'll send a wagon." The wagon came 2 days later. It was not Caleb Hunter who drove it, but an older ranch hand named Sutter, 60s, weathered, with a white beard cropped close and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He loaded Amelia's bag without comment, helped Ethan up onto the bench with a steadiness that suggested he'd done it before, and didn't speak until they were a mile out of town. "Cold up there?" he said then, to no one in particular. "Colder than this." "I know," Amelia said. He glanced sideways at her. "You ain't been up there." "I know it's colder, not how cold. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said, and didn't offer anything else. Ethan sat between them with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes moving steadily across the landscape, the long flat stretches giving way to rougher ground, the scrub and rock beginning to dominate, the sky getting wider and more serious the further north they went. He asked Sutter twice about the horses, and the old man answered both times without shortening the explanation for the child's age, which Amelia noticed. Ethan noticed it too. He sat up slightly straighter. The road into the Black Creek Valley was exactly what Mrs. Dolan had described. Amelia gripped the edge of the bench and said nothing and kept her face neutral because Ethan was watching her, the way he always watched her when things got difficult. He was checking. He needed to know whether to be scared. She kept her face calm, and he settled. The ranch came into view late in the afternoon, when the light had gone flat and gray, and the cold had acquired a specific density that pressed against every exposed inch of skin. It was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something more fortified, maybe. Something that looked as though it had been built to keep something out. Instead, it was a cluster of buildings set against the base of a ridge, practical and unadorned, the main house larger than she'd imagined, the barn and outbuildings positioned with the logic of someone who had thought hard about wind direction and access. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't neglected either. Things were maintained. That meant something. Caleb Hunter was standing in the yard. He was taller than Harold, though that was a low bar. He was lean in the way men get who work outdoors in cold places. Not wiry, but stripped of anything that wasn't functional, with broad shoulders and hands that hung at his sides with a stillness that seemed less relaxed than restrained. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a beard that suggested he trimmed it, but didn't think about it much. His face was not unfriendly. It was not, strictly speaking, friendly either. It was a face that had learned not to commit until it knew what it was committing to. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Sutter. He looked at Amelia. Then he looked at Ethan. Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition, as though the child's presence confirmed something he hadn't let himself fully prepare for. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, deliberate. "Mr. Hunter." She climbed down from the bench before Sutter had a chance to offer help and lifted Ethan down after her. He looked at the boy again. "How old?" "5, Amelia said. "His name is Ethan." Caleb Hunter looked at Ethan for a moment in silence. Ethan, who was cold and tired and examining this tall stranger with the careful attention he gave most unfamiliar men, said nothing. "You hungry?" Caleb said. He was talking to the boy. Ethan glanced up at his mother, then back. "Yes, sir," he said. Caleb nodded once and turned toward the house. "Come in, then." Mess. The kitchen was warm because the stove had been running, and it smelled of wood smoke and something that had been cooking. Beans, she thought, and some kind of salted meat. The table was plain wood, scrubbed clean. There were 3 chairs arranged around it, which she noticed and catalogued without comment. He had put out 3 chairs. He wasn't a man who showed you things, but sometimes things showed anyway. Amelia set her bag down and took Ethan's coat and began the quiet process of settling a tired child, getting him to the table, getting warm food into him, keeping the conversation at whatever level he needed to maintain dignity. She was efficient at this in the way she was efficient at most things, with an economy of motion that came not from ease, but from long practice. Caleb watched her from the corner of the kitchen without seeming to watch, refilling the pot, staying out of the way, doing the hosting without hosting that men who lived alone often defaulted to because they didn't know the other version. Ethan ate with the focused seriousness of a very hungry child. Halfway through, he looked up at Caleb, who had remained standing. "Aren't you eating?" Ethan asked. "Ate earlier." "Why?" "Didn't know what time you'd arrive." Ethan considered this. "That's okay," he said seriously. "You can eat now if you want. We don't mind." Something shifted in Caleb Hunter's face. Not a smile, exactly, but the territory around it moved. He sat down. He ate. After Ethan was asleep, there was a small room off the main bedroom, a room that had clearly been used for storage but had recently been cleared and fitted with a narrow cot. Amelia came back to the kitchen. She had taken down her hair to rebraid it, and she was halfway through when she walked in and found Caleb still at the table with a cup of coffee, and she stopped, self-conscious in a way she didn't usually permit herself. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you were—" "It's your house," he said, "or part of it." She sat down across from him and finished the braid, because there was nothing else to do about it, and she refused to retreat to deal with her hair like a 15-year-old girl caught doing something embarrassing. He looked at the table. "You don't have to stay," he said, not cruelly, flatly. "I beg your pardon?" "What happened in Laramie? With Briggs?" He turned the cup in his hands. Mrs. Dolan wrote, "I know what it was. You don't have to stay here because you have nowhere else. That's a bad reason." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. "And what would be a good reason?" He met her eyes. "Because you read that letter and thought it might work." She was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it moved around the corners of the house with a low, workmanlike persistence. "I read that letter," she said, "and thought you were the first person in this process who told me the truth. That's not nothing." He held her gaze a moment longer, then looked away. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not easy to be around. You should know that." "I'm not particularly easy either," she said. "Harold Briggs told everyone so." Caleb made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed. "I heard. I imagine so." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I'm not here because you're easy, Mr. Hunter. I'm here because your letter told me what the situation actually was, not what you thought I wanted to hear. I find that more useful than charm." He looked at her again. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't hostility, and it wasn't warmth, but it occupied the space between those things in a way that felt more honest than either. "You know how to cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Mend?" "Obviously." "Livestock?" "Not cattle. Some chickens. I'm willing to learn the rest." He nodded, absorbing this. "There's fences need repair in the spring. I'll need help with the south section. Sutter's getting older. His shoulder isn't right." "I can help with fences." He looked slightly startled. "You know fencing?" "I know how to learn," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of two people reassessing something. "Ethan," he said finally. "He's not— Is he sick? He seemed quiet." "He's not sick. He's careful. There's a difference." She paused. "He's been around enough situations where being quiet was the right call. He'll talk your ear off once he decides it's safe." Caleb turned the cup again. "Decides how?" "He watches," she said. "He watches how people treat animals, how they talk when they think he's not listening, whether what they say and what they do match up." She looked at him. "He's 5, but he's perceptive." "That's—" Caleb stopped again. He seemed to stop and start a lot, but not in the way of someone who was vague, in the way of someone who chose words carefully and refused to use them before they were ready. "That's a lot for a 5-year-old to carry." "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask, but something in the quality of his attention shifted. He looked at the hallway where the small room was, where Ethan was sleeping, and the look was not casual. It had weight in it. "Get some sleep," he said then. "Morning starts early." "How early?" "Before it's light." "All right." She stood. "Mr. Hunter?" He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for putting 3 chairs out." He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. She went to bed. She was awake before he knocked on her door. She had always been an early riser, and anxiety, the low functional kind she'd learned to run on, had a way of surfacing before dawn. She was already dressed and in the kitchen starting the stove when she heard him stop outside the door, heard the small pause, heard him decide not to knock. When he came in from the yard 30 minutes later, the coffee was made. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She handed him a cup. He took it. He sat at the table, and she sat at the other end, and they drank their coffee in the gray pre-dawn with the fire building behind the stove door. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not uncomfortable either. It was the cautious, provisional peace of two people deciding, without saying so, to give this a fair chance. Outside, the wind had died. The valley was absolutely still. Ishkeneb. The first week was an education, not just for Amelia, for both of them, though Caleb would not have said so. He showed her the rhythms of the ranch with the efficiency of a man who has explained things to himself for years and is now recalibrating for an audience. She asked questions that were specific and practical, which seemed to either surprise or relieve him. She couldn't always tell which. She did not complain about the cold. She did not ask for the work to be easier. She made mistakes. She miscounted feed portions twice. She nearly lost her footing on the icy path to the water trough. She badly misjudged how long it would take to mend the section of harness he asked her to look at, and she corrected each mistake without drama. He corrected her twice, briefly, and moved on. He did not belabor things. What she noticed was this. He was fair, not warm, not gentle, but scrupulously fair. He did not ask her to do things he wouldn't do himself. He did not hold her early mistakes against her past, their usefulness as information. When Sutter came by on the third day and made a comment that was not quite a joke about whether she'd last the week, Caleb cut him off with 4 words. "She's doing fine, Sutter," and moved on, and Sutter looked mildly startled and said no more. He didn't comment on it afterward. He didn't expect her gratitude for it. He had just said what was accurate and defended it because it was accurate, and that was apparently the end of it. Amelia found this unsettling in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had spent so long around people who withheld things, who built in debts, who distributed small acknowledgments the way misers counted coins, that simple fairness read almost like generosity. She was going to have to recalibrate. Ethan, for his part, was conducting his own assessment. The first 2 days he stayed close to Amelia, watching Caleb from a distance with those careful dark eyes. He didn't avoid the man. He studied him. He was gathering data in the methodical way that children do when they've learned not to trust first impressions. On the third morning, he followed Caleb to the barn. Amelia saw it from the window and said nothing. She watched Caleb reach the barn door, realized the child was behind him, stop. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. Then Caleb pushed the door open and went in, leaving it open behind him. Ethan went through. She didn't see what happened in there. But an hour later, when Caleb came back to the house for something, Ethan was at his side saying something Amelia couldn't hear, and Caleb was listening. Not performing listening, actually listening, with a slight downward tilt of his head that she'd already learned meant he was paying attention. "He showed me how the horses eat," Ethan reported at lunch, with the breathless specificity of a child who has been given privileged access to important information. "They have different food in winter because the grass is gone, and you have to make sure the water doesn't freeze or they can't drink it. Did you know that?" "I did know that," she said. "Caleb says if the water freezes and they don't drink enough, they get sick and can die." He was solemn about this. "It's important." "It is." He let me carry the bucket. He paused. It was heavy. I had to use both hands. He didn't help me, but he walked slow so I could keep up. Amelia looked up from the pot she was stirring. "That was kind of him," she said. Ethan nodded seriously. "I think he's okay," he said, rendering his verdict with the finality of someone who has spent considerable time reaching it. "He doesn't talk a lot, but when he does, it's true things." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. When he does, it's true things. Her son had just named the quality that had made her climb into that wagon in the first place, and he'd done it at age 5 with more precision than she'd managed in her own head. By the end of the first week, she had stopped thinking about what she'd left and started thinking about what was here. The land was harsh and uncompromising, and the beauty of it was the same kind. It didn't ask you to find it beautiful. It simply was. And if you looked up from the daily work of surviving in it long enough, it was impossible not to feel the specific stillness of the valley in early winter, the way the light came off the snow-covered ridge in late afternoon with a clarity that had no sentiment in it. It just was. It didn't care about her. And there was something restful she was surprised to find in that. She stopped falling asleep counting the ways this could go wrong. That, she understood, was probably significant. On the 7th night, she was at the kitchen table with a lantern, working through the ranch's account ledger. Caleb had left it out with a stack of receipts and bills of sale in what she had come to recognize as his version of asking for help without saying so, when he came in late from the barn smelling of hay and cold air and stopped when he saw her at the table. "I found 3 billing errors," she said, not looking up, "and a credit from August that I don't think you collected." Silence. "From the feed supplier in town," she continued. "You overpaid in July. They owe you $4.30. I can write to them if you'd like." More silence. She looked up. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his coat half unbuttoned and an expression on his face that she had not seen on him before. It was not quite surprise. It was the careful, wondering look of a man who has picked up something he expected to be light and found it considerably heavier than anticipated, and is not sure yet whether that's good or bad. "I'm not bad with numbers," she said. "I can see that," he said. She waited. He crossed to the table and sat down and looked at the ledger. Not to check her work, the way he looked at it told her that, but to understand what she'd found. He ran one finger along a column. He looked at the credit line she'd marked. $4.30, he said. 32, actually, but I rounded down because I wasn't sure if you'd had a discount applied. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "No," she agreed. "Why did you?" She thought about it honestly. "Because it's the kind of thing I'm good at," she said. "And it was sitting there, and I was sitting here. And because—" She stopped. "Because?" "Because I'd like to be useful," she said. "Not ornamental, not tolerated, useful." He was quiet for a long time. "You are," he said finally, and went to pour himself a cup of the coffee she'd left warming on the stove. She turned back to the ledger. The lantern flame moved in a small draft from the door. Outside, the valley was dark and cold and immense, and it didn't care about them, and somehow that night that felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. A place that didn't require anything of you except that you not pretend it was something it wasn't. She was starting to understand, she thought, why a man might choose this. She was starting to understand quite a few things, but it was still only the first week, and she was careful with understanding. She had made the mistake of thinking she understood too quickly before, and she had learned, at some cost, that understanding was something you built slowly, out of evidence, the way you built a fence line. Post by post, no shortcuts. She turned the page of the ledger and kept working. The letter from the feed supplier arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into January, and it confirmed what Amelia had calculated to the cent. $4.32. In a bank draft tucked inside a brief note of apology from the supplier's clerk. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while she was at the stove and set it down without a word, then slid it across the wood toward her side of the table and went back to his coffee. She didn't make a thing of it. That was important. She had learned already that making a thing of something with Caleb Hunter was the surest way to make him go quiet, and she had come to value his conversation too much to spend it carelessly. So she just picked up the bank draft, filed it inside the ledger with a pencil note on the appropriate page, and went back to what she was doing. But she noticed that he watched her do it, and she noticed he looked briefly satisfied, not with himself, but with the outcome. There was a difference, and she was getting better at reading which was which. "I found something else," she said, not turning around. "In the ledger? The Granger account from last fall. He owes you for 3 steers, and I don't see a payment recorded anywhere past the deposit in September." Silence. "That's a significant amount outstanding," she said. "I know." She turned around then. He was looking at the table, his jaw set in the way it got when something was bothering him that he hadn't decided how to address yet. She waited. "Granger's got a rough winter," he said finally. "A lot of people have a rough winter." "His wife's sick." She looked at him. "Is she?" "Consumption, they think. Down in town, at the doctor's." Amelia set down the spoon. "How long has she been sick?" "Since October, far as I know." She was quiet for a moment, working through it. "Does he know you know about the outstanding balance?" "He knows." "And you haven't said anything?" "No." "Because of his wife." He looked up then, and there was something in his expression that was not quite defensive but was braced for it, waiting for her to tell him it was bad business, which it was, or that sentiment had no place in accounts, which was also true. She looked at him for a moment and then turned back to the stove. "I'll mark it as deferred," she said. "Not forgiven? Deferred with a note on the date. That way it's documented, and he can settle in spring without either of you having to make it a conversation." Another silence. Then, "You can do that?" "I just described doing it. Yes." She heard him exhale. Not quite a sigh. More like something releasing. "All right," he said. She made the note. She didn't say anything else about it, but she filed the information away carefully. Caleb Hunter, who presented to the world as a man with no softness in him, had been quietly absorbing a debt he was owed because a neighboring man's wife was dying. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't even told his own ledger. He'd just left the line blank and hoped no one looked too closely. There was something there worth knowing. February arrived, and the cold deepened past what she'd thought was its limit and kept going. Sutter came up from town with supplies twice in the first 2 weeks of the month, and the second time he came, he stayed for dinner, which seemed to be an occasional arrangement she hadn't been told about, but was apparently expected to accommodate. She accommodated it. Sutter ate with the appreciation of a man who'd been living on his own cooking for too long, and partway through the meal, he looked at her across the table and said, with genuine surprise that was only mildly insulting, "You can cook." "I can," she said. "The last woman couldn't." "Sutter," Caleb said. "I'm just saying." He speared a piece of potato. The one before her could cook but couldn't abide the cold. The one before that could do neither. He looked at Amelia with the candid assessment of a man who had no idea how to be tactful and had apparently decided long ago that this was the world's problem and not his. "You seem to be managing both." "I'm managing," she agreed. "How's the ledger coming?" He was looking at Caleb now. "She found the Granger thing?" "She found it." "Good," Sutter nodded. "I told you years ago you needed someone to keep those books. You've got too much going on to keep it in your head." "I've managed." "You've approximately managed," Sutter said. "There's a difference." He looked at Amelia again. "He know that word? Approximately?" "He does now," she said. Something shifted at the other end of the table. She glanced at Caleb. He was looking at his plate, but the set of his mouth had changed. He was suppressing something. It took her a moment to identify it as amusement, genuine amusement, uncomfortable, in a face not accustomed to wearing it. She filed that away too.
"That's it, yes."
It was Ethan who changed things first, though she didn't recognize it at the time. He had, as she'd predicted, eventually decided it was safe to talk. The process had taken almost 3 weeks, longer than usual, which told her the threshold had been raised by previous experience, but once it tipped all the way. By early February, he was following Caleb around the ranch with a running commentary that would have exhausted most adults, asking questions not in the scattered way of a bored child, but in the sequential, building way of someone genuinely trying to understand a system. Why did the hay have to be stored dry? Why did cattle grow thicker coats in winter, and whether they could feel it growing the way a person felt a haircut? Why was the barn door hinged on the left instead of the right, and whether that was a mistake or on purpose? Caleb answered all of it. Not patiently. Patience implied effort, and it didn't seem to cost him anything. He just answered straightforwardly, treating the questions as the legitimate information gathering they were. When he didn't know something, he said so. When an answer was complicated, he gave the complicated version and didn't condescend. Ethan absorbed this with the focused attention of a child who was used to adults shortchanging his questions and was recalibrating to someone who didn't. One afternoon in mid-February, Amelia was working on the harness repair she'd finally gotten right. It had taken her 4 attempts and some frank words with herself about the difference between learning a skill and simply trying harder at the wrong method, when she heard Ethan outside. She looked through the small window and saw him standing next to Caleb at the fence line. Caleb was checking the post stability, working his way along the section, and Ethan was matching his pace 3 feet behind, hands in his coat pockets, watching with that measuring attention. Then Caleb said something. She couldn't hear what, and Ethan laughed. She had not heard her son laugh, really laugh, unselfconsciously, the way children do when they've forgotten to be careful, in a very long time. The sound of it hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for, and she had to put the harness down and stand very still for a moment until the feeling settled enough to work with. She picked the harness back up. She finished the repair. She did not cry because she had made herself a rule about that sort of thing, but her hands weren't entirely steady for a while. The thing about living in close quarters with a man who said very little was that when he said something, it landed with a weight that conversation doesn't have when words are plentiful. She noticed she was starting to arrange her days around the points of contact. The coffee before dawn, which had become established routine without either of them formally establishing it. The accounting work in the evenings, which she sometimes sat through without contributing but without leaving either, as though her presence at the table was preferable to the empty room. The 10 minutes at the end of the day when they stood in the barn doing final checks on the animals, often without speaking at all, just moving through the tasks in the particular companionship of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. She noticed she was doing this. She noted it as a thing to be careful about. She was not naive enough to call it anything. She was, however, honest enough to acknowledge that the careful management of whatever it was required actual management. That left unattended, it might become something she hadn't agreed to and couldn't afford. One evening, toward the end of the second month, she asked him about the 3 women before her. She asked it directly because indirection with Caleb Hunter was wasted effort, and because she had decided she wanted to know and had no particular reason not to ask. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "What do you want to know?" "What happened? Why they left?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did that when he was thinking. She had learned to read the gesture. First one came in October. She was from Missouri. Said she could manage a ranch. She could manage a house in a town, which is different. He paused. Left after 11 days, said it was too far from everything. Was it? Did you try to... I brought her to town twice in 11 days, he said. The road takes 2 hours each way in good weather. I have a ranch to run. What about the second? The second was... Another pause. Longer. She was from back east, Philadelphia. She'd been a housekeeper for a wealthy family. She knew how to run a household, and she was good at it. She stayed almost 3 months. Why did she leave? He was quiet. Caleb. He looked up. She had used his first name without thinking, and she saw that he registered it, though he didn't comment on it. I wasn't... He stopped. I was difficult, he said, to be around. I know that about myself. And she wanted things to be... She wanted to talk about feelings, about what we were to each other. She wanted to have that conversation every week, and I didn't know how to do it, and eventually she decided I was incapable of it, and left. He looked at the table. She wasn't wrong that I didn't know how. I'm not sure she was right that I was incapable. And the third? She lasted a week. She came in November, there was an early blizzard, and she decided on day 6 that she wasn't equipped for the winters. She was honest about it, at least. Left a note. Amelia absorbed all of this. Is that why you put it in the letter? She said. About 3 women before? You didn't have to include that. I didn't want someone coming out here without knowing what she was walking into. Most men wouldn't consider that an obligation. No, he agreed. But I found that people who arrive with false expectations are harder to live with than people who arrive knowing the truth, even if the truth cost you the arrangement up front. She looked at him. He looked back. That's a lonely philosophy, she said. It's an honest one. Those aren't exclusive, she said, but they're not the same either. He said nothing, but he kept looking at her in the way he had of looking that suggested he was measuring something. Not her exactly, but something about the interaction. About the distance, or lack of it. She picked up her mending and went back to it. The first real crisis came on a Wednesday at the end of February, and it arrived not as a disaster, but as a slow-moving problem that became a disaster by degrees. 2 of the cattle, a heifer and a yearling, had gotten through a weak section of the south fence line during a night of hard wind, and by the time Caleb realized they were missing at first light, they'd been gone for hours. In February, in the Black Creek Valley, that was not a small thing. Temperatures at night had been dropping to the kind of cold that killed. He found out at 6 in the morning. By 6:15 he was saddled and gone. He didn't come back by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Amelia had made a decision. She had learned enough in 2 months to manage the basic barn work. She did it, all of it, methodically, every animal fed and watered and checked. Then she went to the south section on foot because Caleb had taken the one working saddle horse and the other was lame. And she walked the fence line in the January cold looking for where it had given way. Because if he found the cattle and brought them back, there needed to be a fence to bring them back to. She found the break 30 minutes later. It was worse than she'd expected. A full section had gone down. 2 posts pulled clean out of the frozen ground by what must have been the cattle pushing through in the wind. She didn't have the equipment to reset the posts in frozen ground, but she had wire. She had wire, and she had her hands, and she had 2 hours of daylight left. She fixed it wrong. She knew she was fixing it wrong. It was a patch, not a repair, and it would hold only until the ground thawed and proper work could be done. But it would hold, and she made it hold. And she was back inside before the last light went, and she had lost the feeling in 2 fingers and a strip along her left cheek. She was at the stove when she heard his horse. He came in with both cattle, they were moving stiffly but alive. And he got them settled before he came in, which she had expected. When he finally pushed through the kitchen door, he was white with cold, and there was ice in his beard, and he looked at her standing at the stove and at the pot on the fire, and at the fact that it was warm in the house, and then past her out the window at the dark. "The barn work," he said. "Done. The south fence. Patched. It needs proper repair in spring. It'll hold until then if we don't get another bad wind." He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen on him before. Not gratitude, exactly. More like adjustment. The feeling of a man revising a calculation he'd thought was settled. "You went out to the south line," he said. "Yes. In this cold. The cattle were going to need a fence. You should have waited." She turned to look at him directly. "For what? You were gone. The fence needed doing. I did it." She paused. "I'm not going to apologize for being useful, Caleb." He didn't say anything. "Sit down," she said. "You're half frozen and the coffee's hot." He sat. He drank the coffee with both hands around the cup, and she could see the cold working its way out of him slowly, the way it does when it's gone deep. She put food in front of him and he ate, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the fire in the stove built itself up, and the kitchen got warmer. "You lost feeling in your hand," he said. He was looking at her left hand where she was still flexing the 2 fingers. "It's coming back." "Let me see." "It's coming back, Caleb." "Amelia." His voice was quiet. "Let me see." She set her hand on the table. He took it in both of his, which were still cold themselves but warming, and looked at the 2 fingers pressing gently along the length of each to check the circulation. She watched his face while he did it, the focused attention, the slight line between his brows. "You need to be more careful," he said, not looking up. "I needed to fix the fence." "I know." He released her hand carefully. "Thank you." It was the first time he had said that to her. Not the polite reflex of thank you that people say without thinking, but the deliberate kind that meant something had actually been registered. She picked up her coffee. "The heifer," she said. "Is she all right?" "She'll be fine. She's tougher than she looks." Cattle usually are. Something shifted in his face. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "All 3 of the women before you, I want to be clear about something." She waited. "They left because I made this place harder to be in than it had to be," he said. "Not because the place itself was too hard. Because He stopped. "I don't make it easy for people to stay." She looked at him. "You're making it easier than you think." He met her eyes. There was the question in his again, the same one she'd seen other times, that occupied the space between what he was saying and what he wasn't. "Why?" he said. It came out plainly, without guile, the question of a man who genuinely didn't understand and wasn't pretending not to. She thought about how to answer honestly. "Because you treat me like a person who's capable of managing things," she said. "Not like someone to be managed. There are men who would have come home tonight and been angry that I touched the fence line because it would have meant admitting they needed the help. You came home and asked if my hand was all right." She paused. "That's not nothing." He looked at the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked back at her. "It's the least a person can do," he said. "Yes," she said. And you'd be surprised how many people don't manage it. She stood and started clearing the table, and he let her, and the kitchen settled into the quiet work of the late evening. Outside, the valley was dark and still, the cold pressing against every wall with patient indifference. But inside the stove was going, and the lamp was lit, and Ethan was asleep in the small room with his coat on the hook where she'd hung it, and the ranch was whole. March arrived, and the light began to change. Not warmly, not yet, but the angle of it shifted, and with it a quality of possibility that midwinter actively suppressed. Amelia began planning the kitchen garden that could go in once the ground was workable. She mentioned it to Caleb one morning, not as a request but as information. Here's what I'm thinking about doing. And he looked at the window in the direction of where the garden had apparently once been and said, "The south side of the barn gets more sun, past the first outbuilding. I thought the east side, south gets better drainage and protection from the north wind." She made the note. They said nothing else about it, but 2 days later when she went out to the south side of the barn to check the location, there were stakes in the ground, rough ones, just sharpened sticks, marking off a rectangle in the general dimensions she'd mentioned. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Then she went back inside. She did not say anything about the stakes. Neither did he. But that evening at the table, she shifted the ledger page she'd been using to sketch out the garden plan to where he could see it if he looked. And when she came in from the barn an hour later, the plan had a pencil mark on it. A single addition. A note about where the water access was from the well, with an arrow. This was, she was learning, how it worked with him. Nothing announced. Nothing made a production of. Things just arrived, quietly, and were accepted or not, and built or not, one piece at a time. She thought about the second woman, the one from Philadelphia who had wanted to have the feelings conversation every week and eventually concluded he was incapable of it. She thought about that word, incapable. She thought about the pencil mark on the garden plan. He was not incapable. He just spoke a different language. And it was not, she thought, an inferior one, just one that required you to learn how to listen differently. She was learning. The hardest moment of the second month came not from weather or livestock or any of the practical challenges she'd been bracing for. It came from Ethan. On a Thursday in early March, she found him in the barn in the late afternoon. Not where he was supposed to be. She'd thought he was in the house, but sitting in the hay on the far side of the barn with his knees pulled up. Not crying, but close to it in the way children get when they've been holding something for too long and the container is reaching its limit. She sat down beside him in the hay without asking what was wrong. She had learned, over 5 years, that asking immediately often made it worse. He let her sit beside him for almost 2 minutes. Then he said, "Tommy Granger said we don't belong here." She kept her face neutral. "When did you see Tommy Granger?" "Sutter took me to town when he went for supplies. Tommy was at the store." He picked at the hay. "He said this isn't our ranch, and we're just here because we have nowhere else to go, and his pa says we'll leave by spring like the others." The rage that moved through her was swift and cold, and she kept it completely off her face. "What did you say to Tommy?" "I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say." "That's all right. You don't always have to say something right away." "But is it true?" He looked up at her then, and his eyes were serious and afraid in the way they got when he'd already worked out the answer and was hoping she'd give him a different one. "Are we just here because we have nowhere else to go?" Amelia looked at her son. She thought about the answer carefully because he deserved the truth and not the comfortable version of it. "We came here because we needed a place," she said. "That's true, but so did every person who ever built anything. You don't have to start with a lot to build something real." "But do we belong here?" She was quiet for a moment. "That's not something someone else decides," she said. "Tommy Granger doesn't get to decide that. His father doesn't get to decide that. It's decided by what we do while we're here, by whether we pull our weight and do what we say we'll do and treat the place and the people in it right." She paused. "And we do those things, don't we?" Ethan thought about it. "I carried the water bucket," he said, "both hands." "You did. And I helped Caleb with the fence on the east section. I held the wire." "You did." "So we belong," he said, working it out in the way he worked things out, methodically, step by logical step. "We belong," she said. He leaned against her side. She put her arm around him and they sat in the hay for a while, which was impractical and slightly cold, but occasionally necessary. She didn't hear the barn door open. She didn't know Caleb was there until she heard his voice from the other side of the barn, where the horses were, calm and even, as though he'd been there the whole time. "Ethan," he said, "you want to help me check the water troughs before dark?" Ethan sat up. He looked toward the voice. He looked at his mother. She nodded. He got up and crossed the barn to where Caleb was waiting, and she watched her son's shoulders settle as he walked. The specific unburdening of a child who has just been offered, without ceremony, the exact thing he needed. Not comfort, agency, a job, a place in the work. She sat in the hay alone for another minute. Then she got up, brushed herself off, and went to start dinner, because the night was coming and there was food to make and a ranch to keep. By the end of March, Sutter stopped making comments about how long she'd last. She noticed the absence of it before she noticed the change that had caused it. One day the comments were just no longer there, replaced by something else. A nod when she did something well, the occasional piece of unsolicited ranch advice delivered in his brusque, backhanded way, which she had come to understand was as close to complimentary as Sutter got. "She's good with the books," she overheard him say to Caleb one afternoon, not aware she was within earshot. "Better than you ever were." "I know," Caleb said, "and she's not going to run when it gets hard." A pause. "No." "You sure about that?" "Yes," Caleb said. She went back to what she was doing, and she didn't examine what she felt about that word too closely, because she had the garden plan to finish and the harness still needed oiling, and there was dinner to get on, and there were plenty of things to do in a day without standing still and taking the measure of everything. But the word stayed with her. Yes. Simple and unqualified and certain. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep, and she woke thinking about something else, which was the usual way of things. And she got up and started the stove and put the coffee on. And when Caleb came in from the early barn check, she handed him his cup, and they drank their coffee in the quiet before dawn, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. Outside, the first tentative suggestion of a Wyoming spring was testing its way into the valley. Not warmth yet, nothing as definitive as warmth, but a change in how the cold sat. A slight giving, a hint that the ground remembered, somewhere underneath all that frozen silence, what it was supposed to do next. Amelia wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the window and thought, "We are still here." That was not a small thing. That, she was beginning to understand, was the whole thing. Spring came to Black Creek the way most good things came to that valley. Without announcement, without drama, just a gradual shift in what the air was willing to do. The ground softened first at the edges, along the south-facing slope where Caleb had staked out the garden, and Amelia was out there in the first week of April with a borrowed spade turning the top layer while the frost was still visible an inch below. It was hard work, and she was not good at it yet. Her rows were uneven, and she overworked the soil in 2 sections and had to break up the compaction before it dried. But she did it, and she corrected the mistakes as she found them, and by the 3rd day the bed was workable, and she planted the first seeds with the particular faith of someone who knows the outcome is months away and uncertain and is doing it anyway. Ethan helped. He was serious about helping, in the way he was serious about most things now. He'd gotten more deliberate over the winter, less watchful and more participatory, as though he had finished gathering his data on Black Creek Ranch and its occupants and had made his determination. He planted the bean seeds in a line that was arguably straighter than Amelia's, a fact she acknowledged to him honestly, which made him stand slightly taller for the rest of the afternoon. Caleb watched from a distance. He always watched from a distance. Initially, she had come to understand this as his process, not his disengagement. He observed, assessed, and then entered when he had something useful to contribute. He came over on the 2nd day of the garden work and looked at what she'd done, walked the perimeter of the bed without comment, then went to the tool shed and came back with a different spade, narrower, better suited to the work, and set it against the fence without a word. She used the narrower spade. It was considerably better. She did not make a production of this fact either. This was what their days had become: practical, sequential, interdependent, not romantic, not easy, but functional in the way a good joint is functional. 2 things fitted together that hold more weight together than either would alone. 10. The trouble started with water. In late April, Sutter came up from town with the usual supplies and an unusual expression, tight around the eyes, in a way she'd learned to read as something withheld. He unloaded the wagon with Caleb's help and came in for coffee, and he drank half of it before he said, "Heard something in town you ought to know." Caleb waited. "Aldous Crane is buying up the land between here and the Henderson spread." Sutter set his cup down. 3 parcels so far, according to the land office clerk. The name meant something. She could see it in the way Caleb's posture changed. Not dramatically, just a slight forward settling, the way a man looks when he's readjusting something he thought was stable. "Which parcels?" he said. "The 2 along the creek and the old Merritt property." Caleb was quiet. "Who is Aldous Crane?" Amelia asked. Sutter and Caleb looked at each other. It was Sutter who answered, in the tone of a man who has explained something unpleasant many times and has not found a clean way to do it. "He's a land developer out of Cheyenne, buys up parcels, consolidates them, usually to control water access or passage rights. Once he owns enough, the smaller operations around him find themselves with problems they didn't used to have." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that are technically legal," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "Disputes about where exactly the creek boundary runs. Tolls for passage across land that used to be open. Suddenly finding out the water rights you assumed came with your deed are contested." He paused. "He did it to 2 ranches in the Laramie Valley 5 years ago. One of them fought him in court for 18 months and won. The other one sold. Which parcels does he need to control the water above this ranch?" Caleb looked at her. "The creek runs from above the ridge," she said. "If someone owns both parcels along its upper run, they control what comes down to the lower properties, including this one." She had been working with the ranch's land map for 2 months. She knew where the water came from. Sutter looked at her with mild surprise. Caleb did not look surprised. "The Merritt property," he said, "and the Dillard parcel. If he gets those 2, he controls the upper creek." "Has he bought the Dillard parcel?" "Not yet, according to the clerk." "Then there's time," she said. "Who owns it currently?" "Owen Dillard. He's been trying to sell it for 2 years. Family moved to Denver. Property's been sitting empty." Caleb stood. "Crane will have made him an offer already." "Has Dillard accepted?" "Don't know." "Then you need to make a better one," she said. "Or at minimum, you need to know where things stand before Crane moves." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Sutter. "I'll go to town tomorrow," he said. Sutter drank the rest of his coffee. "There's something else," he said. He said it in the way of a man who has been deciding whether to say it and has decided he has to. "Crane's already spoken to a few people about Black Creek Ranch specifically. He told Jim Harker at the feed store that this property is overextended and the owner is too isolated to defend it if things get contested." The kitchen was quiet. "He said that to Harker specifically," Caleb said. "To Harker and at least 2 others. He's getting ahead of it, making it known you'd be a soft target." Amelia looked at the table. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the accounts, the payments, the documented transactions she'd spent 3 months putting into meticulous order. She thought about the patent on the water rights that was filed with the land office in Laramie, which she had found in the back of a folder while reorganizing the ranch's paperwork in February, and which she had recopied cleanly and filed with a dated notation because the original was faded to near illegibility. "Do you have a lawyer?" she said. Caleb and Sutter both looked at her. "Not a regular one," Caleb said. "You need one. Not because you've done anything wrong, because Crane is already constructing a narrative, and narratives move faster than facts unless the facts are organized and visible." She paused. "I've been keeping the books since January. Everything is documented, every transaction, every deed reference, every water usage notation I could find. If someone tries to contest the water rights, you have a paper record that goes back." She looked at Caleb. "How far back do the original land records go?" "The patent's from 1871. "Then your claim predates anything Crane is likely to be working with. But predating him doesn't protect you if the documentation isn't legible and organized and in front of someone who knows how to use it." She stood.
I'll put together a summary of everything we have. You take it to town tomorrow, you find a lawyer, a good one, and you put him on notice before Crane makes his next move. Sutter was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She realized after a moment that it was respect, unambiguous, and direct. "She's right," he said to Caleb. "I know she's right," Caleb said.
She worked until nearly midnight. The lamp burned low twice and she refilled it twice. And Ethan woke at some point and padded to the kitchen doorway and looked at her with sleepy confusion, and she told him to go back to bed and he went, which was unusual enough that she registered it as evidence of genuine exhaustion on his part. She organized the land documents oldest to newest, cross-referenced the water right patent against the creek boundary descriptions in the original deed, compiled 3 years of water usage records from notations in the old ranch journals that Caleb had kept in a haphazard but consistent shorthand she'd spent 2 months learning to decode. When Caleb came in at 11:30 from a final barn check and found her still at the table, he stopped in the doorway. "Go to bed," he said. "Almost done." "Amelia, sit down and tell me the name of every transaction you've had with any property touching the creek in the last 10 years, she said. "It'll be faster with you here." He sat down. He told her. She wrote. They worked for another hour in the lamplight, and when she finally organized the last page into the folder she'd prepared, she sat back and rubbed her eyes and found that her neck had stiffened in a way that suggested she'd been hunched over the table longer than she'd realized. "Here," Caleb said. He was behind her. She hadn't heard him move. And his hands came down on either side of her neck and pressed once, firmly, working out the knot at the base of her skull. It was not tentative. It was the same directness he brought to everything. And then it was over, and he had stepped back, and she sat very still for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out level. She was good at level. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll leave early." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the valleys settle around the house, and told herself the steady feeling in her chest was satisfaction at a job well done, and not anything more complicated than that. She was not entirely convinced. The next blow came 3 days later, and it came not from Aldous Crane, but from the weather. May in the Black Creek Valley could go either way, and that year it went badly. A late storm moved in off the mountains on a Wednesday night. Not the worst winter storm, not with the full weight of January behind it, but cold and wet and sustained in the particular miserable way of late-season storms that arrive after the land has begun to relax and catch everything unprepared. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 8 hours. Rain turned to sleet, turned to a wet, heavy snow that sat on everything and pressed. Caleb had gone to Laramie the day before and wasn't back yet. Sutter was in town. It was Amelia and Ethan and the ranch. She did not panic. Panic was a thing she'd learned to identify early, the first tightening in her chest, the way her thoughts started moving too fast and in the wrong directions, and to meet it with work before it gathered momentum. She assessed. The animals needed to be in the barn, all of them, and 2 of the cattle were still in the south pasture. The barn needed extra bedding. The water troughs would freeze if the temperature kept dropping. The firewood stack on the side porch was sufficient for the house, but she'd need to bring more in from the lean-to before the paths got worse. She told Ethan the list. She told him simply, without alarm, the way she'd learned to tell him hard things. Here's the situation. Here's what we do about it. "The big one or the small one?" he said. He meant the firewood-splitting maul. "Neither. Just stacking, and I need you to stay on the path, not the slope. The slope will be slick." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. 5 years old, and already he said yes in the same way Caleb did, without inflation, without performance. Just yes. She got the cattle in first. The heifer came easily enough, cold and unhappy and willing to be led. The yearling, the one who'd gotten through the fence in February, was less cooperative, which should not have surprised her because this animal had never been cooperative, not once, in all the months she'd been on the ranch. It shied from her twice and broke toward the back of the pasture, and she had to circle it, which cost her 20 minutes and left her soaked to the knee in wet snow. She got it in. She was not gentle about the last 20 feet. The barn work took another hour. bedding down, water checks, a cracked board on the east stall that had opened further in the cold that she repacked with what was available and made a note to repair properly. She came back through the biting sleet to find Ethan on his fourth trip from the lean-to, moving carefully along the path with his arms full of split wood, his hat pulled low and his boots leaving precise prints in the new snow. He had been counting trips. He told her 7 more would be enough, with the confidence of someone who had measured. They brought in 7 more trips. That was when it happened. She was inside, beginning to shed her outer layers, when she realized she could not hear Ethan. He had been behind her on the last trip. She called his name. Nothing. She called again, louder, and went back out, and the sleet was heavier now, and the visibility had dropped, and the path to the lean-to was empty. She found his tracks. They went off the path, not far, only a few feet, toward the slope she had specifically told him not to go near. He had slipped. The drag marks in the snow told the story clearly. He'd gone down the slope on his side for about 15 feet, and the tracks stopped at a cluster of outbuilding foundation stones where the old spring house had been before it collapsed. Years before she'd arrived, she was already moving. Ethan? Her voice came out controlled because she needed it controlled. She half slid down the slope in the wet snow and found him at the foundation stones, sitting up, one hand pressed to his forehead where he'd hit the corner of a stone. His coat dark with snow and wet. He was not unconscious. He was crying, which was the first time she could recall him crying openly since they'd left Cincinnati. "I'm here," she said. She was beside him before the sentence was finished, her hands moving over him, head first, then checking his arms, his legs, looking for how bad the cut was. It was not deep, but it was on his forehead, and head wounds bled with a drama disproportionate to their severity, and there was blood on his hand and on his cheek and on the snow, and she kept her face neutral. "I went off the path," he said, crying and furious with himself in equal measure. "I can see that." "You told me not to." "Yes. We'll talk about it later. Can you stand?" He stood. His left ankle was tender. She could tell by the way he shifted his weight. But he could bear it, and the slope back up to the path was not far. She went up first and reached back for him, and he climbed with her hand steadying him, and they got back to the path and then to the house. She cleaned the cut at the kitchen table. It needed no stitching. She checked twice to be sure. And she was thorough and efficient about it, and Ethan submitted to this with the seriousness of someone taking his medicine because he's earned the need for it. She wrapped his head with a clean strip of cloth and checked his ankle, which was sprained but not broken, and she told him both of these things directly because he asked directly and he deserved a direct answer. "Is it bad?" he said, meaning the head. "No, it'll be sore for 2 days and the bruise will be impressive." "Will Caleb be angry?" She looked at her son. "Caleb will be worried," she said. "Those are different things. Being angry is about the person who's angry. Being worried is about you." Ethan absorbed this. "Are you angry?" "I'm not angry," she said honestly. She stopped. She thought about what she was. "Relieved," she said. "I'm relieved you're sitting here talking to me." He nodded. He looked at his bandaged head in the small mirror she'd brought to the table and examined the effect with the critical interest of someone assessing damage. "It does look impressive," he said. "It does." Something in his face relaxed. She put him on the settee with a blanket, and the lamp turned low and went back to the stove, and she stood at the stove for a moment with her hands flat on the cold iron beside the firebox, and she let herself feel, briefly and completely, the things she'd been managing since she'd heard the silence where his sound should have been. The fear moved through her, clean and total, and she acknowledged it and set it down. Then she made dinner. Caleb came back late that night, later than expected because the road from Laramie had been rough in the storm. He came through the door with snow on his coat and stopped immediately at the sight of Ethan on the settee with the bandaged head. He was across the room in 4 steps. "He slipped on the slope near the springhouse foundation," Amelia said, before Caleb could speak. "The ankle is sprained, the cut on his head is superficial. He's been awake and coherent all evening, no symptoms of concussion that I can identify." Caleb crouched to eye level with Ethan. He looked at the boy carefully, not panicked, but with a focused attention that missed nothing. He checked the bandage. He looked at Ethan's eyes. He asked 3 questions that were, Amelia noticed, exactly the right questions for assessing a head injury. "I went off the path," Ethan said. He was still not past his own culpability. "She told me not to." "I know," Caleb said. "Are you—" Ethan glanced at Amelia, then back. "Are you worried or angry?" Caleb looked at the boy for a moment. Something crossed his face. "Worried," he said. "Just worried." Ethan's shoulders came down half an inch. Caleb stood and came to the kitchen and stood close to Amelia, closer than their usual distance, and she registered the fact but let it stand. "The animals," he said low. "All in. I got the cattle in before the worst of it. Trough's been checked twice. The east stall board opened up. I packed it. Needs proper repair. The barn work is—" He stopped. "It's done," she said. "Caleb, it's done." Everything held. He looked at her for a long moment. The specific look she'd come to understand meant he was working through something, revising something, and hadn't finished yet. "The meeting with the lawyer," she said. "How did it go?" He pulled a chair out and sat, and she poured coffee and set it in front of him without being asked. "His name is Fenwick. He's out of Laramie, works land cases." He took the coffee. "He looked at the summary you put together." He paused. "He said it was the most organized documentation he'd seen from a rancher in 15 years. She sat down. "What did he say about the crane situation?" "He said we have a strong position on the water rights as long as the documentation is what it says it is." "Which it is." He looked at her. "He also said that Crane has done this 3 times in the territory, and the only ranchers who've beaten him have had lawyers with documentation. And the ones who didn't have that? Lost or sold. Then we have what we need." "Fenwick is writing to the land office about the Dillard parcel," Caleb said, "notifying them that we have a prior interest claim in any sale affecting water access above our creek boundary. It won't stop a sale, but it puts Crane on notice that he can't acquire it quietly." "Good." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "Crane said you were overextended and isolated." "He did." "He's wrong about overextended," she said. "The books show you're not, and he's wrong about isolated." She paused. "Isolated means no resources. You have Fenwick now, and you have documentation, and you have Sutter and however many neighbors will stand with you when this gets contested." Caleb looked at her. "You think it will be contested?" "Yes," she said. "But I think we'll win it." She had said we, and she heard it as it left her mouth, and she did not qualify it or walk it back. Neither did he. Eden. It was 3 days after the storm, with Ethan's ankle improving and the valley returning to something like its tentative spring self, that the thing she'd been carefully not naming announced itself in the most inconvenient way possible. She was at the fence line on the east section, checking what the wet snow had done to the posts, when Caleb came up the slope to help with the section she couldn't reach from the ground. He stepped up on the lower rail to get leverage on the wire, and the rail shifted. It had rotted at the support, they discovered later, and the wet had finished what time had started. And he came off it and caught himself on the fence, but the wire caught his forearm on the way down, cutting through his sleeve and leaving a 4-inch gash just below the elbow. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has hurt himself before and is assessing how much this particular instance is going to cost him in terms of time and function. "Inside," she said. "It's not." "Now, Caleb." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, which had become the site of most of the medical episodes on this ranch, apparently, and she cut back his sleeve and looked at the wound. It needed cleaning and it needed closing. Not stitching. She was not a surgeon, but tight bandaging with pressure, which she knew how to do. She did it efficiently and without ceremony, the way he would have done it himself if he could have reached the angle. What she had not accounted for was the closeness of it. She was used to proximity at work, fixing harness, checking fence, managing the daily tasks that required people to occupy the same space. But this was different. He was sitting still and she was bent over his arm, and she could see the scar on his left hand she'd noticed months ago and never asked about,
and the way his jaw was set against the discomfort of the wound being cleaned, and the particular way he was looking at the far wall and deliberately not at her. She tied off the bandage. She did not immediately step back. "Amelia," he said. His voice was careful. "Yes, I need to say something." He turned and looked at her, which meant she was closer to him than she'd stood voluntarily since she'd arrived. He looked at her with the same directness he brought to everything. Nothing performed, nothing managed, just the thing itself. "I need to say it before I—" He stopped, started differently. "I didn't want anyone to stay before. I didn't want the complication of it. I had the ranch, and that was enough. And I told myself it was enough because I'd lost the habit of imagining anything else." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I don't tell myself that anymore," he said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the valley was doing its tentative spring thing, indifferent and beautiful. "What do you tell yourself?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That losing the habit was a choice, and choices can be unmade." She stood up straight and moved to her side of the table and sat, and this had the effect of reinstating the ordinary furniture of their relationship. The table between them, the cups, the ledger somewhere nearby. But it didn't undo what he'd said, and it didn't undo the fact that she'd heard it, and both of them knew that. "The fence needs to be finished before the rain comes back," she said. "I know. Your arm needs a day." It needs a day," she said. "The fence will be there tomorrow." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. They sat with their coffee, and outside a late-season bird that had arrived ahead of schedule made its irrelevant, cheerful sound, and Ethan could be heard inside his room conducting a detailed imaginary negotiation with something, possibly the blanket, and the stove ticked, and the morning moved on around them the way mornings do, regardless of what has or hasn't been said in kitchens. But something had shifted in the room's center of gravity. Not toward anything yet, nothing dramatic or decided, just a small, real movement in the direction of honesty. The same direction they'd been moving, both of them, since that first night with the 3 chairs and the careful coffee. Post by post, no shortcuts. She refilled his cup without asking. He moved the ledger to her side of the table where she could reach it. The ranch went on around them, imperfect and demanding and entirely real. Fenwick's letter to the land office arrived back with a response in the second week of May, and it was not the response any of them had hoped for. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Amelia stood at the stove with her back to him, and she knew from the quality of the silence behind her that it was not good news before he said a word. She turned and looked at him, and he set the letter on the table and pushed it toward her without speaking, which was, she had learned, his version of not being able to say the thing directly. She read it. Aldous Crane had purchased the Dillard parcel 6 days before Fenwick's notification reached the land office. The sale had been filed, recorded, and closed. The prior interest claim they'd filed was acknowledged, but as Fenwick's careful legal language made clear in his accompanying note, it carried no binding weight now that the sale was completed. Crane owned the Dillard property. Combined with the Merritt parcel he'd acquired in April, he now controlled both banks of the Upper Creek for a stretch of nearly a mile above Black Creek Ranch. "He moved fast," she said. "He always moves fast. That's how he does it." Caleb was looking at the table. He'd had that sale arranged for weeks, probably before Sutter ever heard his name in town. She set the letter down and thought, "What does Fenwick say about the water rights?" "Read the second page." She read the second page. Fenwick's assessment was measured and not encouraging. Crane's ownership of the Upper Creek banks did not automatically void the prior water rights established in the original 1871 patent, but it gave him the standing to contest the scope of those rights, specifically the volume and timing of water draw, in a way that could tie up the ranch in legal dispute for a year or more. He could not cut off the water, but he could make accessing it expensive, contested, and uncertain in ways that would cost Caleb money he'd need for operating the ranch. "He's not going to stop the water," she said. "He's going to weaponize the uncertainty of it." "Yes. He'll make you spend money fighting the contest, and while you're fighting it, you're distracted. Your operating costs go up, and eventually he makes an offer on the ranch that looks reasonable compared to the alternative." Caleb looked at her. "That's exactly what he does." "Then we don't fight the contest," she said. He frowned.
We can't ignore. I didn't say ignore it. I said, don't fight it the way he wants you to fight it. She sat down. He wants a legal battle. Legal battles are expensive and slow, and they wear people down. We document everything, every water draw, every date, every volume, precisely measured and recorded, so that when the contest comes, we have a factual record he can't argue around. And at the same time, we talk to every other rancher whose water comes from that creek above his new property. Caleb was quiet. How many operations draw from the Black Creek watershed? She said. Including mine? 7. Maybe 8 if you count the Hendersons, though they're mostly on the south tributary. 7 ranchers with the same problem, she said. 7 sets of prior water rights. 7 reasons to stand together in front of a judge instead of one. She looked at him. A lawyer fighting for one client is expensive. A lawyer fighting for 7 clients with a unified claim and documented evidence is a different calculation entirely. He was looking at her in the way he had, the measuring, revising look. Crane counted on you being isolated, she said. He said so to Harker. He built his whole strategy around it. She paused. So the answer is to not be isolated. Getting those ranchers to act together is not easy. I know. She met his eyes. But it's possible. And it's the only play that changes the math in our favor. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might be about to tell her it couldn't be done, that she didn't understand how these men operated, that the history between some of those ranchers made cooperation unlikely. She had prepared herself for this, had already begun thinking through the counterargument. Instead, he said, "When?" She blinked. "When what?" "When do you want to have them here?" She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, not surprise exactly, but the particular feeling of being believed in, which was different from being agreed with and considerably rarer. 2 weeks, she said. That gives us time to write out and speak to each of them personally before we ask them to sit in the same room. He nodded once. I'll start with Henderson. He's got the longest running operation, and the others respect him. Good. She pulled the ledger to her side of the table and opened it to a blank page. Tell me about the others, one at a time. Everything you know about what they'd stand to lose and what they'd need to feel safe enough to act. He told her. She wrote. They worked through the afternoon, and at some point Ethan appeared in the kitchen and made himself useful by refilling the water pitcher twice without being asked. And Sutter arrived toward evening and sat down and contributed what he knew about the ranchers in question, and by the time the lamp was burning in the full dark outside, it felt less like a kitchen at a remote ranch, and more like a planning room. 4 people around a table with a common problem, and the specific energy of people who have decided not to accept the situation as it was presented to them. The write-outs took 10 days. Caleb went to Henderson first, as planned, and came back the same evening with the news that Henderson was already aware of Crane's purchases and was, in Caleb's spare summary of the conversation, not happy about it. He was willing to hear more. That was the beginning. Amelia went with Caleb to the Faro Ranch 2 days later, which surprised everyone, including, she thought, Caleb. He hadn't suggested she come, but when she appeared at the barn ready to ride, he had simply adjusted his approach to the horse he'd been preparing for himself and saddled the other without comment. It was the first time she'd ridden with him anywhere beyond the ranch perimeter. The Faros were a husband and wife operation, which was apparently unusual enough in the valley that Nora Faro, who was managing the yard work when they rode in, looked between Caleb and Amelia with a frank and curious assessment before saying anything. Caleb Hunter, she said. Heard you had a new arrangement. This is Amelia Whitaker, he said. She manages the books and... He paused, in the way he paused when a word wasn't quite right. She's the one you need to talk to about the creek situation. Nora Faro looked at Amelia. Amelia looked back. She had prepared for skepticism. She had prepared for the particular polite dismissal that some people applied to women who showed up to business conversations. What she had not quite prepared for was the directness of Nora Faro's gaze. Assessing, yes, but not hostile. More like a woman who has spent a long time being the only woman in practical conversations and has learned to identify others like her quickly. Come in then, Nora said. They stayed 2 hours. Pete Faro came in from the fields an hour into the conversation and listened, and asked 3 sharp questions about the legal standing of the water rights. And Amelia answered all 3 with specifics because she had done the work and knew the numbers. When they left, Pete Farrow had shaken Caleb's hand and then, pointedly, Amelia's. "That's two," she said, riding back. "Henderson and Farrow are the strongest operations," Caleb said. "The others will follow if those two are in." "Not all of them. The Granger situation. Granger's wife is still sick." "I know. We go to him last, and we go carefully." He glanced at her. "We? You went to him alone before, about the outstanding balance, and you said nothing because his wife is sick." She looked at the road ahead. "Someone needs to ask about his situation without making him feel like it's charity. That's a conversation that goes better with a woman present." He was quiet for a moment. "You're probably right." "I know I'm right," she said, "but you can agree at your own pace." She heard the sound beside her. She was beginning to be able to identify it, the abbreviated thing that was as close as he usually got to a full laugh. It happened more than it used to. The meeting at Black Creek Ranch fell on a Saturday in late May. 7 ranchers came, with Henderson bringing his eldest son and Sutter driving 2 of the smaller operators who'd had trouble with their wagons. Amelia had prepared the kitchen and extended it into the front room, moving the furniture to accommodate numbers, and she'd cooked for 2 days prior. Not elaborate food, nothing that suggested she was performing hospitality rather than providing it, but sufficient and good. She had learned from watching Caleb that sufficiency without waste was what this world respected. She sat at the table with the ranchers. She had considered whether to do this, whether it was presumptuous, whether the men would receive the information better from Caleb alone, and she had decided that hesitating to participate in something she had organized and researched was a form of dishonesty she wasn't willing to indulge. She sat. If anyone objected, no one said so. She presented the water rights documentation first. Not with speeches, not with appeals to emotion, but with facts laid out in sequence. This is what the original patents establish. This is the timeline of Crane's acquisitions. This is the specific legal mechanism he is likely to use to contest. This is what it costs each individual operation to fight that contest alone. This is what it costs proportionally if they fight it as a unified claim. Henderson asked about Fenwick's credentials. She told him. He nodded. One of the smaller operators, a man named Cowboy, younger than the others, with the defensive posture of someone who felt himself outnumbered in most rooms, said he didn't see why a land dispute above the valley was his problem when his own deed was sound. "Because Crane doesn't need your deed to be unsound," Amelia said. "He needs your water to be unreliable. A ranch that can't count on its water draw doesn't need to lose its title to fail. It just needs one bad summer." She looked at him steadily. "Your deed is fine. Your water is what's at risk." Cowell was quiet. Pete Farrow said, "She's right." The conversation went for 3 hours, and it was not smooth. There were disagreements about cost sharing for the legal fees, one rancher who wanted to pursue individual rather than collective action and had to be walked through the math of why that was a worse outcome twice, and a difficult 20 minutes when it came out that Henderson and the rancher Boone had a prior dispute over a shared fence line that had apparently never been properly resolved, and that introduced a temperature into the room that had nothing to do with Crane. Caleb handled that one, briefly and without choosing sides, in a way that acknowledged the dispute was real, without letting it derail what they were there for. By the end of the evening, 6 of the 7 ranchers had agreed to the collective filing. The 7th, Boone, still radiating fence line grievance, said he needed to think. Henderson told him, on his way out, that he had a week, which was more time than Crane would give them, and Boone's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Sutter, washing his plate at the basin after the last wagon had rolled out, looked at Amelia and said, "That went better than it had any right to." "It went the way the preparation allowed it to go," she said. He made a sound that was as close to agreement as Sutter ever got on matters of credit, and finished his plate and left. Caleb was in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen, watching her clear the table. "Boone will come around," she said. "Probably. Henderson will make sure of it. Those two have history, but Henderson won't let Boone's pride cost him his water rights." She stacked the plates. "We should have Fenwick's collective filing ready to present to them both within the week. I'll ride to Laramie Monday." Take the documentation folder, the updated one. I added the May water measurements this morning. He came to the table and picked up the other side of the work, clearing without being asked. They moved around the kitchen in the established efficiency of people who have done this together for months, and the house settled into its night sounds. And somewhere in his room, Ethan was asleep. Had been asleep for 2 hours, in the uncomplicated way of a child who'd spent the afternoon helping Sutter with the horses and exhausted himself thoroughly. "Amelia," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was holding 2 cups and looking at her with the expression that she'd come to understand meant he'd been working toward saying something for longer than tonight. "Sit down," he said, "for a minute." She sat. He sat across from her and set the cups between them and looked at his hands on the table, then up at her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about the arrangement. Either way, I want to be clear about that first." She waited. "I want to know if you'd consider making this permanent," he said. "Not the arrangement, not the employment of it. I want to know if you'd be willing to marry me. Actually marry me." He held her gaze. "Not because you need somewhere to be and I need the books managed, because I want you and Ethan here and I want it to be—" He stopped. "Real," he said. "I want it to be the real thing." The kitchen was entirely still. She looked at him for a long time, at the careful way he was holding himself, the particular controlled steadiness of a man who has said the hardest thing and is now doing the honest work of waiting for the answer. She thought about the first night in the 3 chairs. She thought about the narrower spade left against the fence without comment. She thought about him crouching to eye level with a 5-year-old with a bandaged head and answering worried without hesitating. "You said it doesn't change the arrangement either way," she said. "It doesn't. You've thought about what it means if I say no." "Yes." "And you're still asking." "Yes," he said, because not asking seemed worse. She looked at her own hands on the table. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the train. She thought about Harold Briggs looking past her shoulder, and Mrs. Dolan's leather satchel, and the worn letter with its blocky handwriting and its one true sentence. She thought about what it felt like to arrive somewhere expecting to tolerate the terms and discover, over the slow months of actual living, that the terms had quietly become something she didn't want to leave. "I came here expecting a transaction," she said. "I know. I'm not very good at expecting things. I tend to work with what's actually there." He was watching her. "What's actually there," she said, "is a man who left a space at his table before I arrived, and kept his accounts honestly, and told his ranch hand I was doing fine without being asked, and has never once, not once, made me feel like a burden." She paused. "What's actually there is more than I knew how to expect." "Amelia." "Yes," she said. He went very still. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted to be clear. "I'll marry you, not because the arrangement requires it, because you asked honestly, and the answer is honest too." The silence that followed was not the silence of absence, but of 2 people sitting inside something that had just become true and taking a moment to recognize it. Then Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in the kitchen of the ranch they had been building together for 5 months, with the lamp burning and the stove ticking and the valley outside doing its indifferent and beautiful thing in the dark. "Tin," she told Ethan the next morning. She had considered how to do it. What words, what framing, how much to explain, and how much to let him absorb on his own schedule. She had decided, in the end, to tell him the way she told him most important things, directly, at the kitchen table, without softening it into something other than what it was. "Caleb asked me to marry him," she said. I said yes. Ethan looked at her. He looked at his oatmeal. He looked at her again. "Does that mean we stay?" he said. "Yes." "Forever?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, the focused, processing silence she knew well by now. "Does he know I come with you?" he said. Not worried, practical. He was verifying the terms. "He knows," she said. "He specifically asked about both of us." Ethan nodded slowly. Then he picked up his spoon and went back to his oatmeal and said, with the tone of someone issuing a conclusion, They've worked their way too honestly. Good. Because I know where everything is now, and I'd have to learn it all somewhere else. She kept her face straight. That's a practical consideration. I have a lot of those. I know you do. She got up to check the stove, and she kept her back to him for a moment because her face was doing something she'd rather do in private. And she stood at the stove and let it do what it needed to do, and then put it away and turned around and poured more coffee. That afternoon, Caleb asked Ethan if he wanted to help rebuild the gate on the north pasture. It was not a small job. The posts needed resetting and the cross members had warped over the winter. And Caleb explained what the work involved before asking, which was his way. Ethan said yes and got his coat and his hat with the careful purposefulness of someone heading to an important appointment. Amelia watched from the window as the two of them walked to the north pasture, the man and the 5-year-old. Ethan, matching his pace in 3 steps to Caleb's 2, already talking, already asking the first of what would certainly be a long series of questions about gate construction. Caleb listened, head slightly down, and then said something that made Ethan stop walking for a moment and then nod vigorously and start again. She turned away from the window and went back to the ledger. The legal filing went into the Laramie court in the first week of June, with all 7 ranchers named. Boone had come around, as Henderson had predicted, on the strength of a 20-minute conversation with the older man that no one had been present for, but the result of which arrived in a short note to Caleb saying simply, "I'm in." Fenwick filed the unified water rights claim with the court and sent notice to Crane's attorney in Cheyenne. The response came back in 10 days, and it was aggressive. Crane's attorney contested the collective standing of the claim, argued that the individual patents needed to be adjudicated separately, and attached a 20-page document asserting that the scope of water rights established in the 1871 patents was limited to domestic use rather than agricultural irrigation, a distinction that, if upheld, would effectively gut the operational water access of every ranch in the watershed. Fenwick read it and wrote to Caleb, "This is a serious challenge. It is also, in my view, wrong. But wrong in court costs money to prove." Amelia read the letter and thought for a full day before she answered it. She went into Laramie with Caleb that Friday and sat in Fenwick's office, a small room above the land office that smelled of paper and old coffee, and laid out what she had found in 3 months of working through historical ranch records. A letter, dated 1873, from the original territorial land commissioner to a previous owner of the Henderson Ranch, explicitly confirming that the 1871 patents carried agricultural water rights. The letter had been filed with Henderson's original deed and had sat in a box in his barn for 30 years. Henderson had found it when she'd written to him asking if he had any historical correspondence relating to his water patent. He had sent it with a note that said only, "Thought this might be useful." Fenwick held the letter and read it twice. "Where did you—" "I asked," Amelia said. "Everyone with an old operation has old paper. Most of it is disorganized because no one told them to organize it. I asked each of the 7 ranchers to look through anything they had from before 1880. She paused. "Henderson is the only one who found something directly on point, but he found it." Fenwick looked at Caleb. "This changes the case substantially." "I know," Caleb said. "If this letter is authentic, and I see no reason to believe it isn't, it constitutes documentary evidence of the territorial government's contemporaneous interpretation of those patents. Crane's argument about the scope of agricultural rights becomes very difficult to sustain against this." "Will he know that?" Amelia said. "His attorney will." "Yes." "Then how quickly will he know that we have it?" Fenwick looked at her over his spectacles. "When I file it, which will be— What happens if you notify his attorney informally first, not file, not commit? Just indicate that new evidence has come forward that materially affects the scope argument?" Fenwick was quiet. "You said Crane has done this 3 times, she said. 2 ranchers fought him in court and one sold. The one who sold? Do you know why? Cost, primarily, and uncertainty. If he knows the uncertainty has shifted, if his attorney tells him that the documentary basis for his scope argument has been undercut before they've spent the money on full litigation, what does he do?" Fenwick tapped the letter on his desk. "A man like Crane calculates," he said slowly. if the cost of the legal battle exceeds the likely value of the outcome. He recalculates his options, she said. Caleb was watching her. Fenwick was watching her. I'm not a lawyer, she said. You know the right way to handle this, but I know accounts, and I know that the moment Crane filed his attorney's response, he began spending money on this contest. Every day of litigation is a cost to him, too. If his attorney tells him the evidentiary ground has shifted, he has to decide whether to keep spending into an uncertain outcome or find another path. Fenwick was quiet for a long moment. There are conventions around this sort of communication, he said carefully, but it's not unprecedented. He looked at the letter again. Let me think about how to proceed. They rode home in the late afternoon with the summer light long across the valley and the smell of the warming grass coming off the slopes, and Amelia sat on the wagon bench with the particular tight alertness of someone who has done everything that can be done for now and is waiting for the world to respond. You think he'll back down, Caleb said. I think he'll recalculate. That's not the same as backing down. It's just a different decision made with different information. What if he doesn't? Then we fight him in court and we win, she said. But it'll take longer and cost more. I'd rather he recalculate. He looked at the road ahead. When did you figure out the letter might exist? When you told me Henderson was the one the others respected, that meant he'd been there the longest. And the longer someone has been somewhere, the more old paper they have. She paused. I asked everyone. Henderson was the one who found something. That was... He stopped. What? Good thinking, he said. He said it plainly, which was how he said things that he meant. She looked at the road. We're not done yet. No. But we're in a better position than we were this morning. Yes, he said. We are. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't require filling, and the valley was long and gold in the June evening, and the ranch was visible from the top of the ridge in the particular clarity of that light. The barn, the outbuildings, the house with its column of smoke from the kitchen stove where Sutter had agreed to look in on Ethan, the south garden now showing its first real green in orderly rows. Amelia looked at it from the ridge and felt the weight of the months behind it, the cold and the difficulty and the slow building piece by piece, and she thought, this is what we made. Not smoothly, not without cost, not without the mistakes and the hard days and the things that had come within reach of failing, but real, documented, defended, theirs. Fenwick's informal communication to Crane's attorney went out on a Wednesday, and the response took 11 days. 11 days was long enough for Amelia to stop checking the road every morning and start accepting that the waiting was simply the next piece of the work. Not comfortable, not easy, but manageable in the way most hard things were manageable if you treated them as conditions to operate within rather than problems that should have been solved by now. She measured water draws every other day and recorded them in the ledger with the date and volume and weather notation. She finished the south garden fence that had been half done since the spring storm. She wrote to Fenwick twice with additional documentation she'd found in the older ranch journals. Not because the case needed it, but because having more was better than having less, and she was not capable of sitting with incomplete information when complete information was available. Caleb watched her do all of this without comment, which was his version of support, not getting in the way of the things she needed to do, not offering reassurance she hadn't asked for. He had his own version of waiting, which involved fixing everything on the ranch that had accumulated through the winter and spring as deferred work. The gate on the north pasture that he'd rebuilt with Ethan was only the beginning. By the second week of June, he had replaced the cracked board in the east stall, reset 3 fence posts along the south line, repaired the water trough fittings that had been leaking since February, and begun work on reinforcing the lean-to roof before the summer storms came. Ethan helped with all of it. Not as a project, not as a lesson. He just showed up wherever Caleb was working, assessed what was needed, and made himself useful in the specific ways a nearly 6-year-old could make himself useful, which turned out to be more ways than most people would have expected. He had been watching and accumulating knowledge for 6 months, and it was beginning to show in what he could do with his hands. One evening, Amelia came out to find him holding a board steady against the lean-to frame while Caleb nailed it, both of them with the focused wordlessness of people in the middle of a physical task that required attention. Caleb said something low that she couldn't hear, and Ethan adjusted his grip by an inch. And Caleb drove the nail, and the board seated flush and clean. And Ethan looked at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has contributed to something that will last. She went back inside before either of them saw her. Crane's attorney's letter arrived on a Thursday. Caleb brought it in from the road still sealed and set it on the table in front of her without speaking. She recognized Fenwick's handwriting on the outer envelope. He had forwarded it with his own accompanying note, which she opened first. Fenwick's note was 2 paragraphs. The first summarized what had happened. The second was a single sentence. In 20 years of land law in this territory, I have seen Aldous Crane withdraw from a contest exactly once before. You now have the second instance on record. She set the note down and read Crane's attorney's letter. It was formal and carefully worded in the way that legal retreats always are. No acknowledgement of weakness, no concession of the evidentiary problem, a great deal of language about mutual interests and the costs of prolonged litigation, and the desirability of resolution without further expenditure by either party. Stripped of the formal language, it said, Crane was withdrawing his contest of the water rights scope. He would retain ownership of the Dillard and Merritt parcels, but he would not pursue the agricultural rights argument, and he would file with the court a notice that the 7 ranchers' collective claim was undisputed. He was keeping the land. He was giving up the fight for the water, which meant he had done the calculation Amelia had predicted he would do, found that the numbers no longer favored him, and pivoted. Not because he was a reasonable man, she had no illusions about that, but because he was a calculating one, and the calculation had changed. She read the letter twice, then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, because the thing that moved through her was not triumph. It wasn't clean enough for triumph, but something more complicated and more real. Relief and exhaustion and the slightly dazed quality of having held a weight for so long that setting it down made you uncertain of your balance. Caleb was watching her. "It's done," she said. He read the letter. He read Fenwick's note. He set them both down and looked at the table and then out the window at the south slope where the garden was green and growing in its uneven rows. "He'll try again somewhere else," he said. "Someone else's land." "Yes," she said, "but not ours. Not this summer. Not this way." "Not this way," he agreed. She picked up Fenwick's note again and looked at the last line. The second instance on record. She thought about what that meant, what it had actually required. The 7 ranchers around the kitchen table, Henderson's 30-year-old letter in a box in his barn, 3 months of water measurements and ledger organization and late nights with the lamp burning, Caleb writing to Laramie with a documentation folder, and the willingness to trust a lawyer with what they'd built together. None of it dramatic. None of it the way people talked about fights being won, which was usually in terms of force and confrontation and someone being defeated. This had been different. This had been paperwork and patience and the refusal to accept isolation as a given. "I need to write to the ranchers," she said. "All 7. They should hear from us directly before they get anything through official channels." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight. It won't take long." He looked at her with an expression she recognized as the one that was about to become an argument about whether she needed to rest, and she looked back with the expression that was her answer to that particular argument, and he made the small sound that meant he had assessed the situation and decided to redirect his energy elsewhere. "I'll check the barn," he said. "Take Ethan. He's been in the house since supper." He went. She wrote the letters. Ibad. They were married on a Saturday in early July in the yard of Black Creek Ranch, with Henderson and his wife present as witnesses, and Sutter standing near the fence in his best coat with the expression of a man attending something he approves of but would not admit to approving of in direct language. Nora Farrow had come with Pete and 2 of the other ranchers' wives, and the occasion was small in the way that things on that land tended to be small, practical, real, without performance. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldrich from Laramie, who had ridden up that morning and would ride back that afternoon, and he said what needed to be said in the plain language that the law required, and Caleb and Amelia said what needed to be said in return. Ethan stood beside Amelia through the whole of it in his coat with the collar that she'd repaired twice, holding her hand with the particular grip of a child who is not frightened but wants the contact anyway, the grip that says, "I am here, and you are here, And that is the point of the hand-holding, not the ceremony, but the fact of each other. When Aldrich pronounced them married, Ethan looked up at Caleb with the evaluating seriousness that had characterized most of his assessments over the past 7 months. "Are you my father now?" he said. He said it plainly, not with hope loaded into it or anxiety, just as a question requiring a factual answer. Caleb looked at the boy for a moment. Then he crouched down to eye level, which was the thing he had always done when he talked to Ethan about something that mattered. And he said, "I'm what you need me to be. That's up to you." Ethan considered this with visible seriousness. "Could I call you Caleb still?" "Yes." "Or could I call you something else if I decided to later?" "Yes." Ethan nodded, filing this away as a decision to be made on his own schedule and not before he was ready, which was entirely consistent with every significant decision he had made in his life so far. Then he looked at Caleb and said, "Okay," and held his hand out in the formal, solemn way he had sometimes of offering handshakes, which he'd seen the ranchers do and had adopted as his own. Caleb shook it. Henderson, standing 3 feet away, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. His wife put her hand on his arm. Oh. The summer built itself around them. The garden produced better than Amelia had expected for a first year in unfamiliar soil. The beans came in strong, the root vegetables took, 2 of the 3 herb plantings survived and spread. She expanded the plot notes in the ledger, recording what had worked and what hadn't with the dispassion of someone building a body of knowledge for the years ahead. Because there would be years ahead. That was not an assumption anymore. It was a fact, documented and defended, as real as anything else in those pages. The water ran clean through the summer, undisputed. Crane did not reappear. He was, according to a letter from Fenwick in August, pursuing acquisitions in a different part of the territory entirely, further east, where the land was cheaper and the prior claims less organized. Amelia read this without satisfaction and without surprise. Men like Crane did not stop. They recalculated and moved. The only answer to that was what they had built: documentation, solidarity, the kind of community that noticed when someone was trying to pick off its members one at a time. She wrote to Fenwick suggesting that he share the water rights documentation template she'd created with the other ranches in the watershed who weren't among their 7. The smaller operations, the newer claims, the ones who hadn't been in the room that Saturday, but whose water came from the same mountain. Fenwick wrote back that he thought it was an excellent idea, and would she be willing to correspond directly with those parties to help them organize their own records? She said yes. She added it to her week. Caleb read Fenwick's letter and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You're going to end up knowing every rancher in the valley." "Probably," she said. "Is that what you want?" She thought about it honestly. "I want the water to stay clean and the claims to stay clear and our neighbors to be in a position to defend themselves if someone comes at them the way Crane came at us," she said. "If that means corresponding with people I've never met about their land records, then yes, that's what I want." He looked at her with the particular expression that she had come to understand meant he was looking at her and seeing something that consistently surprised him, not because it was new, but because he hadn't finished being surprised by it yet. "All right," he said. "I'll need postage money from the operating account." "You are the operating account." She turned back to the letter she was drafting. "Then I'll approve it myself." He made the sound. She kept writing. Ethan turned 6 in August. He had requested, with characteristic precision, that his birthday include 3 specific things: a cake with dried apple in it, because he had decided this was his favorite, a full day of working with Caleb on whatever needed doing, rather than being given a day off from chores, and the opportunity to ride the older saddle horse alone without someone leading the rope. The cake was accomplished. The workday was accomplished. The riding was a subject of brief negotiation, the terms of which Amelia understood as Caleb determining the distance and conditions, Ethan accepting these conditions without argument because he understood they came from assessment rather than doubt. She watched from the south pasture gate as her son rode the old horse in a slow circuit of the paddock, sitting with the careful deliberateness of a child applying everything he'd absorbed over 7 months of watching and listening and asking questions, his small hands holding the reins with a lightness that was better than it had any right to be for a first solo attempt. Caleb was at the fence 10 feet from her, watching in the same quality of silence he brought to things that mattered. "He's good," she said. "He'll be better in a year. He's good now." "Yes," Caleb said. "He is." Ethan completed the circuit and pulled the horse to a stop at the gate with more control than she'd expected, and looked at them with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "How was that?" he said. "Good," Caleb said. "Could I do another one?" "Yes." He went. They watched. It was the simplest kind of moment. A child on a horse in a summer paddock, two adults at a fence, the valley going about its business in every direction. Nothing historic, nothing that would be written down anywhere except, perhaps, in the quiet ledger of what a life is built from. Entry by entry, day by day. She thought about the platform in Laramie. She thought about Harold Briggs looking past her shoulder. She thought about how close she had come to getting on that train. Not that she had seriously considered it after the first hour, but the possibility had been real, and she had been $12 from necessity rather than choice. She thought about the letter with the blocky handwriting and the single sentence that had told the truth when truth was the only thing she had room for. She had come here expecting to survive. She had not known that surviving and building were not always different things, that sometimes the act of getting through one day and then the next was accumulating quietly beneath you, the foundation of something you couldn't have planned for because you couldn't have imagined it from where you started. That was the thing no one told you, the thing she would have wanted to know, back in the Cincinnati spare room with the mending and the small portions and the careful management of what hope she could afford, that you could not always see what you were building while you were building it, that it required a particular kind of faith, not in outcomes, not in other people, but in the work itself, in the value of doing the next right thing when the right thing was available to you, even when you couldn't see past it, post by post. That was what she'd told herself in February, working through Caleb's accounts by lamplight. She hadn't known then that she was describing something larger than fences. Fun. September brought this first cattle sale of the year, and with it a different kind of accounting. The summer herd had done well, better than the previous year according to Caleb, because the water had run reliably through the dry months, and the south pasture had produced more than usual, both facts traceable to conditions they had defended. The sale prices were reasonable, the transactions documented in Amelia's ledger with a clarity that had already saved them twice from disputes about terms, and the operating balance at the end of the month was the strongest Caleb had seen in 3 years. He told her this at the kitchen table on the last evening of September, looking at the ledger the way he'd looked at it that first night, not checking her work but understanding it, the way you understand something that has become yours. "We should expand the south pasture," she said. "The fence line is limiting what we can run. If we move it another 40 yards along the ridge, we pick up a section that's been sitting idle. That's a significant fencing job. Spring project. We'll have time to plan it over winter." He looked at her. "You're already planning next year." "I'm always planning next year." "I know." He closed the ledger. "I'm not objecting." She looked at him across the table, this man she had come to in December with a worn bag and $12, and a 5-year-old who held her coat, this man who had put out 3 chairs and left a narrower spade against a fence and crouched to eye level with a child who needed an honest answer. This man who was difficult and fair and not easy and entirely real in all the ways that mattered. "What are you objecting to?" she said, because the tone in his voice had something behind it. He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "I'm thinking about last December." "What about it?" "I put out 3 chairs," he said, "and so on, and I didn't know if I was being hopeful or foolish." "Both, probably," she said. "Both," he agreed. He looked at the table. "I didn't know how to want something enough to plan for it. I'd spent a long time not wanting things I couldn't count on. And now?" He looked up. "Now I'm planning the south pasture expansion for spring." She held his gaze. There was nothing elaborate in his expression, no performance, no reaching for sentiment, just the plain face of a man telling the truth, which was, she had come to understand, his most consistent and most reliable gift. "So am I," she said. Winter came again to Black Creek, as it always did and always would, without asking permission and without softening itself for the convenience of the people who lived there. The first snow came in November, earlier than last year, and the valley went white and still in the way she now recognized not as threat, but as season. The annual requirement to draw inward, to rely on what you'd prepared, to trust the work of the months behind you. The firewood was stacked high. The animals were in. The larder was full in a way it had not been the previous winter, when she'd arrived with nothing, and the ranch had been the subsistence operation of one man living alone. The ledger was current. The correspondence with the neighboring ranches was organized in a separate folder that had become its own kind of record, not just of water rights and land claims, but of the slow building of something that didn't have a formal name in any legal document, but that was, in practice, the thing that had beaten Crane. A community that paid attention. People who knew each other well enough to ask whether the other one had any old paper in a box in their barn. Sutter came for dinner on the first Thursday of December, as he had done most Thursdays for the past several months, and he ate his food and drank his coffee and told Ethan a story about a horse he'd known 20 years ago that may or may not have been entirely true, and Ethan listened with the grave attentiveness he gave to all information before filing it for future reference. When Sutter left, Ethan helped clear the table. He did this reliably now, without being asked, because at some point in the past months it had become simply what happened after dinner in this house, and then announced that he was tired and went to bed, which was early enough that Amelia put her hand to his forehead reflexively, and he submitted to this with the patience of someone who understands that a mother's hand on a forehead is a form of love even when it's also an assessment. No fever, just tired. She kissed him and told him good night, and he was asleep before she reached the door. She came back to the kitchen, and Caleb was at the table with his coffee, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting in the way he sometimes sat at the end of a day, when the day had been sufficient and there was nothing more required of it. She sat across from him. Outside, the snow was coming down again, steady and quiet, and the lamp made the kitchen warm and yellow and small in the way that winter evenings do when the dark presses against the windows. "A year ago tomorrow," she said, "I was on the platform in Laramie." He looked up. "I know." Harold Briggs was looking past my shoulder. "I know. And I was thinking—" She stopped. She thought about what she'd actually been thinking, honestly, without the improvement that time applies to hard memories. "I was thinking that I'd made a mistake. Not coming west, coming to Briggs specifically. And I was trying to calculate whether there was enough time before the next eastbound train to find a different situation, or whether I was going to have to go back and I couldn't figure out how to go back." She paused. "I was very close to just getting on the train." Caleb looked at her. "Why didn't you?" "Mrs. Dolan," she said. "Timing. And your letter." She looked at her hands on the table, and the fact that Ethan had watched men look past his mother for most of his life, and I wasn't willing to let that be the last lesson he learned from Wyoming territory. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't get on the train." "So am I." "I know I don't say things like that easily." "I know," she said. "That's why it counts when you do." He reached across the table, the same gesture as the night she'd said yes, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the kitchen while the snow came down outside and the stove built itself up and the year settled around them. There are people who look back on the shaping moments of their lives and see them clearly. The turns, the choices, the platforms and letters and worn bags that changed everything. Amelia would look back in the years that followed and see December on a Wyoming platform and a woman who was $12 and one bad decision from the end of something, and who chose instead to read a letter carefully. That was all it was, at the beginning. Reading carefully. Believing that honesty in 4 paragraphs was worth more than charm in 40. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved by a man or a ranch or a lucky turn of circumstances. She had brought herself here, assessed what was real, and built from it, post by post, entry by entry, conversation by conversation, until the thing she'd built was large enough to stand in. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that ever actually works in the end, showing up with what you have, doing the next right task with honesty and without illusion, and trusting that the accumulation of real days builds real ground beneath you. Some people learn this early, some learn it late. Some spend a life looking for the version of it that doesn't require the hard work of the plain version. Amelia had learned it in a Wyoming winter, in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, with a man who put 3 chairs out because hope and preparation were, for him, the same action. She'd learned it post by post, and the fence held, but
to do a free consultation with the personal trainer so we can see where I'm at and like what I know. And every single thing he was asking, I was like, hey, so this is what I have at my home gym. He started like, I basically had more equipment and more access to things than what they had at that gym. I was kind of surprised. I don't think they even had a squat rack there, which kind of, but you don't need that. You don't need a squat rack to work out though. Went to the gym and they asked me what the machine I was most familiar. I pointed to the Mayor. I fucking love your jokes. Way to go on the steps, by the way, on your Fitbit. Fuck yeah. And 100% I wasn't trying to say horrible. I was just trying to say my way is the best. Oh, I'm sorry if it can't. Oh, no. Wait, what did I miss? Oh, I might have missed something, by the way. You're all good, though. Oh, no, I don't think